Welcome to Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity today. Today, myself and Marc are delighted to be joined by a friend of the podcast, David Morimanno, also known as DJ. He's a cybersecurity veteran with over 2 decades of experience who actually started his tech journey by dumpster diving for computer parts. He's come a long way since then. He's now Director of Identity and Access Management Technologies at Integral Partners LLC, and DJ brings a unique perspective on the human element of cybersecurity and the evolving landscape of digital identity. So today, as well as finding out a little bit about DJ's journey in the industry, we're also going to tap into his expertise, discuss the identity and access management landscape in 2024, see what's working, what isn't working, and see where things are going to go next. So DJ, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It should be a fun conversation.
So I'm going to actually ask the first question to Marc here. Marc, this is quite an interesting story here because we normally talk about people starting off their journey with their first computer, but not with dumpster diving for computer parts. Have you ever done any dumpster diving?
Dude, I have definitely done dumpster diving. It's funny, older me with kids version, I'm like, how did I used to jump in like a giant dumpster behind the business? And you're like, just kind of, you only live once. And I guess there was no random sharp glass or anything else in. But I think one of my favorite times dumpster diving was here in Southern California, where I grew up as a teenager, and finding old, we were over at one of the telephone company buildings, and we essentially found like an old set of manuals for one of the kind of electronic switching systems, just trying to learn the commands and everything else. Also found some certificates. So then we were officially, 16 years old or whatever, certified as linemen or whatever it was, right?
That's awesome.
But but I did get first computer was a hand-me-down. I didn't get it from parts from a dumpster. So I'm super curious how that went, like what you were able to cobble together, man.
Yeah. No, you never know what you're going to get when you dive into someone's trash or a dumpster. You could find some pretty cool treasures, or you could find something already living in there and you need to get out. So it's a big mix of things. But no, when I was a kid, obviously I didn't have a computer, and one of the things I kind of thought of is people are throwing all kinds of things away, not just computers, but electronics, VCRs, all kinds of stuff. It's like, if I could just learn how to fix some of that stuff, I could make a little side cash. So as an early teenager, I was going around doing just that, and then I would finally, get enough computer parts, and obviously I'd go down to kind of the public library and read about CPUs and read about this and read about that, and kind of cobble things together in my own understanding. And I think the first one I've ever put together that was successful was an original Pentium CPU, and I had it kind of laid out in a shoebox because I couldn't find a proper case. So when I actually got the right parts, it was able to barely play Doom, but I was able to get a let's just say a free version of Doom at the time, and play that pretty well. But then that's kind of how it started, just building up computers, taking what people didn't want anymore or didn't see value in, and getting it to the point where someone else could see the value of it, and made that as a little side hustle for a good 10 years until I got a real job.
That's fantastic. Were there any particular gems apart from that early PC that started you off playing the dumpster dive version of Doom?
Yeah. So I actually, one of the times I went in, I found, those little like fire safes that people buy that, they put papers in case the house catches on fire. It's not really meant to keep it locked up like an actual safe. But so I found one of those, and I was probably about 14 years old, and I was like, yeah, I could probably pop this open pretty easy. I don't know what's in it, and who knows what it could be. So I took it into my dad's garage, and I kind of popped it open, and there was $1,000 in cash just sitting in this machine, in this safe. And I'm like, that's a pretty good find. But to be truthfully and to be honest, so I knew who threw it away because I got it out of their trash. So I actually went back to them and gave them the money back, because I was like, it's a really neat find. I got a cool story out of it, but this really isn't my money. It was an elderly woman who's like, she just couldn't figure out how to open it, and she shook it around and couldn't hear anything, and so she threw it away. Obviously, it was just dollar bills, so it's not making any kind of noise. So yeah, so that's kind of my favorite find. But I did return it for all those listening. I did give it back to the to the proper owner.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think the universe has paid you back with good karma there, because that's a fantastic thing to have done there. And if anyone, by the way, if anyone ever does find one of those safes, I found this out a few years ago, if you email the manufacturer or call them up and sound confident and say, can you send me the drilling instructions for this? They'll just send you a A4 template that you can put against the safe and drill it to open it. So if anyone's looking to break into any of those safes that they find in dumpsters or anywhere else, legitimately, that's how you go about doing it. Anyway, David, so how did you go from those kind of early days? You were interested in technology. How did that then start to lead into a career in cybersecurity and computing?
I think it was probably out of necessity. So obviously I did what I was doing, dumpster diving, building all that, somewhat out of necessity. Needed a little extra cash for this and for that, and help the family out a little bit at times. But then as I, got into the actual job market, I didn't jump directly into IT. I didn't really have any backing to show I knew what I was talking about. So I started working at Pizza Hut and worked my way up really quickly in about a year and a half's time to being a manager. And, I was probably about around 17, 18 at this time. And as soon as I became 18, I became a manager. And I'm like, I really feel like something's missing. Like I really liked learning and building computers. I really liked helping people, fix their computers. And so I was talking to my district manager. I'm like, I think I'm going to try to pursue something different. Like, I'm not saying I'm quitting right now, but I think I want to try something different. And it's only fair I give you a heads up. And he's like, oh, by the way, if you're interested, we need to replace all the dial-up connections across these 45 stores for the entire franchise with satellite. If you're willing to help out in your free time, we'll give you a little bonus here and there, but you can learn from our IT department. And it's like, sweet, that sounds awesome. So I managed during the evenings, and during the day I was on the roofs replacing satellites, and really at that point learning how networks worked, and we're learning how different types of topologies and the ISO layer. I got to learn all that basic stuff just out of curiosity. And to be honest, from there, every time there was a moment in my life where after I met my wife and we started having kids, I'm like, I need to make a little change in my career. I started looking around, and opportunities kind of opened themselves up, and just having enough confidence to take them kind of led me through, working with some of the largest companies in the world. Obviously, I won't mention any names on the podcast right now, but some of the largest companies in the world, I've ended up helping create their identity programs, helping them develop what they need to do with their cybersecurity programs, and kind of saw the evolution of this space. And then obviously trying to be pliable enough myself to evolve with it was kind of my goal.
So let's get into that a little bit, because I think you're just one of those people who, you've come and spoken at our company events, and, you get involved in lots of activities, and you just know this space inside out. So how have you seen the field of identity access management evolve from when you first became involved in it to where it is today?
Yeah, so I think anyone who's been in this space long enough will know that there was a time when identity really wasn't in the conversation at all. It was kind of a side thing. It just, you go into an organization and you talk to them, and they know that people get onboarded, they know people get hired, they know people get terminated. That's the extent of it. Like they really didn't put much effort and much cadence to understanding it, locking it down, securing it. It just wasn't in the conversation. It was something that was occurring, in some cases very well, in some cases not so well, but it was never in the conversation. And then I would say probably around 2005 to 2010, we started to see some changes in regulations. We started seeing a lot more, people taking things a little more seriously because fraud started becoming more and more prevalent. Now, at the time, still, and fraud's always been around. Let's just be clear. I'm not saying it was invented in that time period, but what ended up happening is it became a little bit easier because there was this transition. You think about where we were in our timeline. We had just kind of came out of that .com boom of the 90s, right? And as we get into that mid to late 2000s, a lot of things were now available that were never available on the internet. A lot of information. You kind of we're coming out of the MySpace, getting into the the Facebook era as it occurs. People are putting information out there. So fraud, frankly, became easier to get information and to execute. So what ended up happening is, well, we've got accounts, we've got data, we've got, our crown jewels, we've got this information. We need to start protecting that and getting more serious about that. And obviously, I'm skipping over a big piece of this, Sarbanes-Oxley and the whole, Enron and all of that, which I think goes back further as a genesis to this. But people know that story a million times over. What ends up happening, and when talking to companies, is they start to see this need to kind of protect what's theirs and protect their clients and protect their customers. And it's been a long journey, but there was this slight incline towards the conversation as to, we need to protect this data, but how is this data really protected? Well, we work our way back. It's users and the way they access the data. And then obviously at that time period, all the data was basically, let's just call it in a big cauldron. And we decided to, put the fire ring around it to protect it. Like, all the data was in-house. All the data was in our data centers. All the data belonged to the company. And so we really put a big emphasis as far as the industry on spinning up the whole castle moat mentality. And it existed before this, but we put a lot of investment in, modern firewalls and blocking and tackling, at the perimeter. And then the concept of hybrid work started getting real popular, to the point some companies would be completely against it, some would be completely for it, and somewhere in between. So this concept of hybrid work brought another challenge, but it wasn't something that everyone was doing. It was in pockets. Then obviously what we learned leading up all the way to the pandemic, because the pandemic then kind of pushed everyone out to the edge, everyone out, outside the perimeter, is that the real gatekeepers to our data, the real gatekeepers to our information are the people, are their identities. It's, the firewall is great, and having that castle and that moat is great. And if you still have all your data in one data center and you got a lock and key on it, great. But it still takes one person to open the door for the wrong actor, and things can happen. So this whole concept of more of an identity-centric security really started becoming more in the conversation. So really, I don't really look at it as a technology evolution over those last 20 years. It's a conversation. It's an evolution in conversation, which drove some of the things that we're seeing today. And obviously, we can talk insider threat and all that stuff. That stuff has existed. It's become probably a little more prevalent because, not necessarily that every user is a bad actor, but if you follow the principles of zero trust, you kind of have to pretend like you should trust nobody and you should have visibility to everything they have. And it doesn't matter if, you're the best friends with them, continually validate them. So there's these concepts over the last few years that really has, come along the way with the evolution of that discussion. So basically, to summarize, if I went back 20 years, it wasn't in the discussion at all. And now it's all we talk about. So it's done a complete 180. I do think there are changes yet to come with this. I don't think that we finally have found the magic bullet of, the identity is the protector of all things. So they're locked down the identity. I think it goes a little bit deeper, especially on a psychological level than that. But I think we're definitely better now than we ever have been in having an intelligible conversation that the true keepers of our data are the people using that data. And we need to make sure that we've got that under the proper control, the proper visibility. We need to be able to respond and detect appropriately. All that has definitely evolved in that time period. And I could spend a whole hour just talking about this timeline, but I'll pause there.
Well, we do have the best part of an hour, so...
Yeah, no, I think the timeline's fantastic, and like to your point, right? We always speak in terms of those different inflection points in security of just like what you were saying, right? Thinking about the perimeter, thinking about endpoint as the perimeter. Now, of course, years back, people coined the phrase around identity as the perimeter and so forth, right? But it really is this kind of like broad domain, and one of the things I always kind of come back to. When I think about kind of like first principles in security, and everything in some ways comes back to like attack surface, right? And that's it's really a game of, do you know your attack surface? Are you properly controlling it and so forth, right? Not to oversimplify, but for podcast's sake, I'm going to oversimplify. But one of those kind of most important attack surface definitely is in that realm of identity. And I would almost like push further in the sense of like the end of the day, it's not even so much the identities, but it's the fact of like what privileges do those identities actually have, right? Because kind of a given account alone doesn't necessarily mean it can kind of access anything, right? And so it's an interesting cross section because one of the things I've seen is that and you were talking about in a great way of that kind of evolution where really did kind of in the early days of identity start as the control the human, privilege the count, right? Like you think historically something like PAM or kind of where identity started from, it was always around that, and it's really just kind of to me more broadly that like controlling privileges for all types of accounts, and it's not about the accounts, because it is like if somebody is a domain administrator account or a global administrator account or whatever, but it's that privilege they have or that relevant access they have is the key thing that you're trying to control. It's something I always try to educate with customers, because I think if you can kind of see the privileges and access as the central thing, then it's more malleable as the world continues to change, where it's like it doesn't matter if it's like privilege from like a Kubernetes perspective, or privilege from a human identity, or privilege for a non-human API account, or whatever it might be. But I'm just kind of curious how you think about that, like that intersection of like, identity, privilege, how that's kind of been changing. The explosion of, was it many years ago, the phrase around, essentially software eating the world, and every company is really a software company. And with that explosion comes and that also means everybody has a lot of, machine to machine communication processes, automation, etc. Right? Now, I'm curious how you think about, anything in that realm.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things to dissect in that bit. I mean, I think that could be a whole conversation in itself, but let me add a little bit to it and then kind of talk about it. So yeah, there's, NHIs or non-human identities, of all forms or flavors, or as I like to refer to them as just non-carbon based life forms. They all have permissions, they all have tasks, they all have duties, right, in your organization. And that they've, to be honest, they've kind of always existed in the organization in some form or fashion. There's just more of them now, as well as more types of them, as organizations evolve and technology evolves. But at the end of the day, if we look at the carbon-based life forms and we look at the non-human accounts, the non-carbon-based life forms, it really does hinge, at least the way that we look at the world today, on their privileges, what that account can access and where it can access them. Hence the attack surface comment. And that's ever changing. It has been changing. We used to be everything on-prem. Now we're hybrid. Some people are all in the cloud. Some people have issues with, and we saw this in 2024, a massive attack to the supply chain because, they're going after weaker links and easier targets. So go after your vendors that have your data, and ultimately, the data is what they're after to be able to do damage or to take advantage. But it all then comes back to the privilege. But all that being said, if we look at the evolution of, it used to be you're a domain admin or you're an administrator, you need this privileged access. So you get the access and you get the access to do your job. Then we said, well, that's fine, but now we need to segment that access. We need to segment that access from your day-to-day stuff to your administration stuff. And then we got to the point where that's not good enough. Now we need to lock it down. We need to put it in a PAM tool. We need to have some sort of checks and balances to show that, you're getting the account and you're the one getting that account, and there's that validation. And everything really up to really recent times, I say recent times, probably in the last couple of years, has been all about what the privileges that the account has and who's using that account and where they're using it. And in my mind, the biggest gap there that we struggle sometimes to solve is what and why are they doing with that account, the behavior of that account. Humans are naturally creatures of habit. and pattern. And I would argue that non-human accounts are probably even more so because they're typically only used for a particular task or series of tasks, and they're used in a more repeatable process. So we really need to bring some more intelligence into the picture. And we really need to look and see not only what the accesses are that you have, what the accounts are that you have, and what they have access to do and where they're doing them, but why are we doing it? Why are we doing the things we're doing? And where are we doing the things? And how are we doing? And all these things need to come together to really look at the behavior. Because at the end of the day, I think the utopian vision that a lot of analysts would love to see is that privileges don't exist except for the time they're needed. You know, a true ZSP or zero standing privilege model, kind of the next evolution of just JIT or just in time, like true ZSP. Is that practical today? Not really. Not in all cases. I mean, I think in very isolated use cases, sure, but it's not a mainstay right now. It's actually very difficult to even have the conversation about it with certain administrators. Because, you know, they're like, that's my access, that's my job. We need to work on this together, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very psychological thing going on right now. But I really, truly believe that the behavior right now is what we need to pay attention to. And you see a response to this in the market. You know, ITDR solutions are kind of spinning up. Everyone's kind of talking about the detection and the response. What they're really doing is looking at the patterns of behavior and then the circumstances for that and then responding to it. So you look at things like, starting to use AI and bringing AI into the conversation to provide some intelligence around the analysis, because people will argue, and I would love to have this conversation with you guys someday or anyone you would like to bring on to the podcast. But I know folks that will argue that we've always had this. We've dumped it into a SIM. We've got the logs. We know the information, but I've never talked to someone who runs a Splunk implementation or an environment with, logarithm or name your tool of flavor, where they haven't complained about all the false positives and all the data and all the noise and all the information. It's because the true intelligence isn't in the picture there. The ability to look through that and find those patterns that we actually care about. So I'm kind of giving you a very long-winded answer to basically just say that, I think just like our timeline conversation, when we look at privileges and we look at managing, what we need to manage today and why we need to manage it and the evolving of the attack surface and the attack chain, understanding those paths to privilege as to who has access and how they have access to them is all good stuff. But at the end of the day, the big question still isn't being answered, which is, what are they doing with this access? Is it appropriate? Is it appropriate in this scenario and appropriate at this time? And I think it's so hard to answer that. One, again, the intelligence piece is missing. But I'll add this, principle one of zero trust, if you want to, go to the NSA or NIST or whoever's model you want to look at, is around visibility. And I think visibility has been an issue that organizations have struggled to tackle since, the dawn of time when it comes to, someone's digital footprint to today. Knowing where all these places are to look, what they have, I think is a fundamental thing to build. Then you should be looking for, watching for, checking for these patterns. So obviously, I don't know if I'm answering the question directly, Mark, but that's kind of where I'm heading.
and likewise, I think there's multiple points I could get wrapped up into. So we will certainly do another one of these. I can already tell. But I thought it was super interesting what you were saying about. We see that also, and obviously I'll say out front that I'm kind of biased in terms of the premise that sometimes customers have, and I get where they're coming from of the like, well, I have all this identity activity data via I send all my events from all my different systems to my SIM, and it's looking for misuse and abuse, right? And one of the things I told our own engineering team, when I came back to BeyondTrust a few years ago, with the goal of trying to, whether you want to think about it of kind of redefine PAM or kind of extend beyond, what PAM has traditionally done. If you think of PAM as the thing that's always been, just as the name implies, privileged access management, the kind of management of known privileged accounts. And the things that were important is, beyond the what we were saying earlier, like the expansion in the like non-human identities and many other things. But also this like idea that, when I talk to customers, I'm like, well, why do you want to manage your most privileged accounts and put them under lock and key? And of course, the answer is because if they get compromised, the fallout from it, the blast radius of such an attack could be world ending, depending on the scenario of the company, right? And so the thing I always thought was interesting of so wouldn't you like something that can actually tell you about the thing you're worried about most, the misuse, the abuse, et cetera, of these identities? When you really kind of ask people, when's the last kind of instances of finding something like that in their SIM, it's much more of a rarity. And again, my bias here is that SIMs themselves just quite literally don't have all the kind of data necessary, right? Because they have all the kind of event behavior, but there's none of the contextual information about like the resources, the identities. Like, do you have that kind of broad graph of metadata around all these things, right? Like with most things in kind of in a broad sense for decision making, like you need enough context to really make good decisions. That's why there's plenty of stuff that at a SIM level will be like, this person's logged into a thing they've never done before or from a place they've never done before. But when you get into the much more nuanced scenarios, quite literally the data's not the data's not there. And so one of the things that makes me think about is that there's also this like gap from maybe like a kind of an operational perspective, where a lot of companies they see their security as like a set of domains from like servers to workstations to cloud to SaaS, and most all the kind of product categories fall along those lines, right? You got cloud security, you got SaaS application security, and so forth. And the thing I always try to educate with customers is that like identity crosses all these things. An attacker might start on-prem, end in the cloud, vice versa, start in the cloud, end in on-prem, start originally from SaaS. It feels like a lot of companies are just like not really kind of unified, not just from like a tooling and technology perspective, but just even like organization structure. And so I'm curious, kind of changing up topics here, but like there's definitely, like I said, many places we could go from the technology perspective. And I'm curious, kind of what do you see? Because you guys help a lot of companies kind of mature, right? I look at it as there's plenty of products and technology out there, but it's really about like the people and process around them. Otherwise, who cares, right? Like really. And I say that as a product vendor, right? Like you can't just go buy the thing and it magically does it, right? You can, but that's how you end up in the headlines. So how do you tailor it to your environment and use it to kind of mature your organization? So I'm curious kind of how you see that has been evolving, right? Where like identity is this central domain, but sometimes it's still kind of a narrow team and it's disconnected. And I'm just curious how you see the current state and maybe where you would like to see that kind of evolve organizationally.
Yeah, let me, and before I answer that, let me make a comment, because I think it will kind of play into my answer as well. But let me make a comment on SIMs still before we leave that arena. I go and you kind of hit on this a little bit. I go into organizations and my company, does a lot of advisories with a lot of top tier organizations. And I go in and I start, kind of poking around and asking questions and really try to get a sense of kind of where they are and what their current maturity level is, really get an understanding of their use cases, their challenges, et cetera. And we'll talk about that here in a second. One thing that is almost like a uniformed answer every time I go in and I start talking to CISOs or CIOs, CTOs, and I'm like, hey, what is the thing that you're worried the most about? What keeps you up at night? And you get some pretty good answers, but almost every time the uniformed answer is, I don't know what I don't know. That's like always the answer. And I know people have heard that and it sounds probably cliche at this time to say it, but think about that in the context of where we are today with like SIMs. Like SIMs are really good about telling you what you want to know, but you have to know what to ask. Like the data's there, lots of data's there. Like I want to know anytime James logs into this server and anytime he doesn't do this. Like you're telling it what you want to know. and it's doing what you ask, right? So you've built this relationship up now with this technology that, although provides good value and a good view, keep in mind it's a perspective of the view of the organization. It's not the organization in its totality, but you're still having to know what to ask. You're still having to know what to look for, and that's the intelligence gap that we're seeing right now. And I think that we need to have solutions, and I think a direction in the right, the momentum going in the right direction of things like ITDRs and et cetera. There's still room to grow there, but I think they're trying to look at that more holistically to provide the answer to, here are the things you should care about. Here are the things you should ask about. Here are the things you should look at, versus going to the organization and they're asking you and are asking of your SIM and your technology, I want to do these things, and then say, I don't know what I don't know. So we've got this gap. So I wanted to throw that out there because I think there's a lot of things that people should be thinking about, answering that question to what you don't know sometimes is a little more elementary. Bringing in an expert or bringing in someone who can do an evaluation of your organization to really point you to the things that you should that not necessarily answer the question in its totality, but answer the question in a way of, here's the things you really should be asking and things you should be caring about. We could spend a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort to uncover all the shadows in the organization, but what we'll realize, some of those shadows really weren't worth uncovering for the investment. We know based on our experience, here are the things you need to be looking for. And I think there's an intelligence gap there. So, but taking it back to your question then, when I go into these organizations and I'm talking to them, about the value of having an identity-centric security approach or mindset, and why identity is important, because obviously, data itself is closer to the edge than it ever has been. And obviously the gatekeeper to that identity to that data is typically the identity, like we discussed. But getting that in the conversation isn't the hard part. Acting on it is typically a little bit more of a challenge. Providing a strategy on how we should do that, because most organizations still look at identity as a thing in its silo. There's organizations I talk to where identity isn't even part of security. Like it's still looked at as an operational thing. Onboarding, offboarding, it's still pushed aside. Obviously it's more in the conversation than it ever has been, but the reality is identity is in everything, and it is everywhere in your organization. You can't pretend like it isn't. You're not going to get to any bit of data in your organization without some sort of identity that has access to do so. So we need to look at things more holistically. And I go in and I help organizations do just that. We look at all the security controls and the security aspect and all the objectives that we're trying to do to lock things down, all the regulations and all the guidelines and all the best practices. And then we look at the operations and how things are being done. And we look at things from kind of a tactical perspective. And then we look at things from the identity perspective. Where's identity interwoven? The identity fabric, people have probably heard that term a million times by now, but it truly is this interwoven methodology and ensuring that our technologies and our approaches and our teams are really working with each other. And at the core of it is identity. And I'm struggling right now, or the industry is struggling to kind of make sure that organizations understand that identity should be kind of the core, or at least the genesis of that security conversation, not brought in later into the security conversation. And that's just because of the landscape we work in right now. And I don't want to leave out the network, SASE and, ZTNA and kind of that secure connectivity that needs to occur. Obviously there needs to be rails for the train to move on. But at the end of the day, you still need an engineer to get the train going, and you need, you've got all your passengers, you need to ensure that they all got a ticket to be on the right train. So this all needs to work together to make things happen. But I as far as where I really think that this needs to go, and I kind of alluded to this just a second ago, but I honestly believe that when you look at your organization and you look at the users in your organization, you need to also believe that those users have taken your data and have put them in places outside your organization, whether that's legitimately through a SaaS provider or some sort of vendor, or maybe they're like, hey, this is a file that I need to work on tonight. Let me email this file to my personal email and work at it at home. These things happen. These things occur. So, we need to not necessarily put all of our focus into how do we prevent these things, but look at the individual, look at the identity, and ask, why are they doing these things? Because one of the biggest issues that security has had since security has been in the conversation is security provides friction to the business, provides friction to the user. It provides complications. And I will guarantee you, it's our human nature to do this. We will put more effort and energy going around something if we think the thing we need to do is going to add too much friction or too much effort into our day-to-day. We want the path of least resistance. We want it easy. We want it convenient. So security is at this point where it truly needs to be convenient. If security and our approaches to security are not convenient, we're going to have this uphill battle that we've always had, and it's just going to get worse. That being said, I'm sure someone listening is like, well, there are times you need friction. Well, that's where the intelligence comes back in, looking at the patterns and the behavior. Yes, there are times that, we need to dial down friction and we need to dial up the friction depending on the scenario. If all of a sudden Mark is going to go to the Bahamas and start, tapping into some accounts he's never tapped into, but yet he's, sitting in his home office, something's a little wrong there. Maybe we should ask for validation again and then maybe again. And maybe we normally don't check on these certain applications, but that's a little funky what he's doing. So let's revalidate each step of the way, turn that friction up. And to the point, Mark's calling the service desk. It's like, what's going on? Like, something's not right. Like, we're getting to that point. We need to do such a thing. So again, I'm going a couple different directions there, but it really is getting us to a point where having a holistic vision of your organization with security, understanding your networking, how people are connected, and then identity at its core is really what you need. You need to understand the challenges of the business, understand where to remove friction, where to dial up friction, understand how these teams should be working with each other and the importance of these silos being broken down, because it's people and process before technology. I would never start with the technology. Let's talk people and process, and then we can bring technology into the conversation to allow us to address people and process. But all along the way, keep in mind, business and IT should mirror each other. Anything the business does, IT's got to support. Any friction you add to the business is just going to make your day that much more fun. So there's a lot of multifaceted conversations that need to happen. And that's where I come into an organization, is having these conversations on your behalf, getting that understood where you are, where you need to go, how you need to go there, the strategy to get there, and hopefully giving you a kind of a paint by numbers picture so you can see what that looks like down the road.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And one of the things you mentioned was the ability to even kind of ask the right questions in the first place. And I think that's why obviously folks like yourself are in high demand, right? Because you're somebody that can help kind of guide things in that way, get to the right questions, think about things in a way that's not adding friction. And also there's I think a lot of times the challenge in security is, you can see the 100 different problems and think that you need to solve all of them and that you're ever going to have the time, resources, focus to solve all of them. But at the end of the day, you got to make some bets, right? And there's some stuff that you got to prioritize, execute, etc. And so somebody like yourself being able to help kind of think through that stuff, I think is critically important. And, it's something I talked to the product management team a lot at BeyondTrust, and kind of how we think about like building products in this space, right? Where at the end of the day, by the time there is an acronym from analysts, by the time that there is customers knowing to ask or competitors solving for this or that problem, it's typically because there's a few years of pain in the market of different attacks and things that have been taking place, right? And so I always think it's fundamentally important, when I think of like, trying to build, whether building software for these problems or kind of consulting to the problems, you have to be close to the problems themselves, right? Like at the end of the day, what makes building security software much more unique than any other type of software is, yes, you have the input from customers and partners and analysts and the kind of market and competitors. But the most important input you have is where are attackers going, how their attacks are evolving. And if you're only kind of focused on the kind of traditional areas of kind of responding and building software once the problem is well known, there's no problem with that. That can be a good business, right? Like well-established understanding and category and solving the problems well. But if that's all you're doing, then it's always kind of a bit late at some sense. And so it's something that I'm constantly trying to educate with customers where, you'll find the kind of the kind of focused understanding of where, companies might have a good handle because of the long history of on-prem Active Directory security and the many, many identity related pitfalls with it. And there's a much more ready to go understanding of the questions to ask, the things to worry about. I still think you have a prioritization problem and some other stuff, but it does become interesting. And, we've even been at a couple conferences together, right? It's like speaking where, you start to talk about, some of these kind of timeless concepts like least privilege or whatever else. And you start talking Azure and then cloud and then SaaS or like different types of environments or the interplay and kind of pass the privilege between them. And the kind of knowledge level can drop off quickly. And so kind of in wherever you want to take it, is there, I realize it's company dependent, if you're all SaaS and some laptops, or if you're all on-prem kind of traditional data center, your risks are going to be different. But is there any kind of areas that you think are, companies are maybe needing to wake up more to from kind of an identity security, like as far as like areas of focus that you kind of consistently see people not thinking about as much as they maybe should? And again, I realize it's a bit environment specific. So whatever sample size of, averaging out for companies you want to go for.
Yeah, so I do think it is environment specific, and I do think it's industry specific. And if you're an organization that has OT and versus IT, like there's a lot of variables, right? But let me talk on something that I think is a little more universal. Then I'll break it down. And I see this more and more prevalently in this year than any year, but it's always been around. Obviously, if you read between the lines of the 2024 Microsoft, vulnerability report, the number one vulnerability isn't, a traditional vulnerability. It's a human. The person's the biggest vulnerability. We're the weakest link in the chain. And so when I talk to organizations, a lot of times they overlook that. They think they could just put in a tool or put in a process, and things are, going to be hunky-dory and everything's going to be fine and they'll never get breached again, or they'll never have an issue. Where the reality is I don't think we understand, to one of my previous comments, that we really need to look at the human nature of our users and try to play into those lanes and not against them. Make things convenient, make things easily understood. Some people I've seen organizations gamify certain things, and that helps, but obviously that's not going to work for everyone. So it's a multifaceted response, a multifaceted answer. And at the end of the day, I don't think you're going to get 100%. We're all human. We're all flawed. We're all going to make mistakes. But above all, we're gullible. We'll believe whatever it is we want to believe, which kind of brings in an interesting thought around AI and deep fakes. And we've seen a huge uptick of ransomware and the cost of entry to do some of these things because of AI is so low now. I mean, that, the skill set's so low that really anyone can start Google searching and find something on ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever your flavor of choice is for AI and create something convincing and make somebody fall for it. So I think that's something that should be in the conversation. I wanted to put that out there because, yes, there's all these interesting variables that are very dependent on the industry, depending on this, depending on that. But I don't care what industry you're in. I don't care what size of company you have. I don't care what your target market is. At the end of the day, you're still all working with people that are your biggest vulnerability. So knowing what they have access to and their behaviors, and then obviously addressing those with things that fall into that swim lane. And I'll just say it right now. I don't think any vendor that's out there in the cybersecurity space, even the identity space, really takes that into consideration just yet. I think it's in the conversation, but I don't see the fruits of that conversation just yet. So when I do go into organizations, though, let's take it a little bit deeper. Let's kind of go beyond that, what I think is a very important item that I'm continually advocating to have in the conversation around the human factor. Let's talk about, the things you talked about. Just in time, you've got IGA, you've got lifecycle management, you've got what I call kind of these traditional, or let's just say the pillars of a good identity program, or the pillars of a good cybersecurity program that should be there, the foundation to build upon it. Every organization's at a different maturity level, which is why I always start with the conversation, asking the questions, figuring out where they actually are compared to where we really need to take it. So that starting point is going to be different, but I would say that the foundations that need to be in place, let's maybe change the question a little bit, because I think that starting point is such a big variable that I could say one thing and someone listening is going to be like, that's not relevant for me because of X, Y, Z. But to mature an identity program, you need to have a solid IGA process. And I just be clear, I used identity program. I didn't say project. These things don't have a start and a stop. They when you get them rolling, if you're doing the program appropriately, it's a living, breathing thing in your organization. It never dies off if you're doing it right. So within an identity program, having a good process for identity governance administration, tying into your onboarding processes, understanding who has access to what, validating that access, and then obviously terminating the leaver. Now, the mover process is a whole thing we can talk about. Truly understanding when someone starts what they should have access to, getting them that access in a timely manner, and then deprecating that access appropriately is kind of like a 101 what you need to have. But keep in mind, that's not something that has to be in place before you start PAM or before you start access management. That's a foundational pillar that a whole series of the program is going to be built on. Then you got things like PAM, which I think is a foundational pillar of an identity program as well. Where most organizations need to start there is the visibility of where all their privileged accounts are. If you can figure out where they are, and you can start locking down the credentials and rotating the credentials, which I call core PAM or legacy PAM. Like PAM is so much bigger than that, but again, this is where people typically start. Locking down, privileges on the endpoint, making sure that you've got the ability to run the things that you need to run, and then things are elevated and delegated appropriately. So you've got this now other stepping stone of your identity program starting to form. And then we've got access management where, your interconnectivity of different directories are trusted. You've got your federation, you've got your single sign-on, you've got your multi-factor and your challenges, and you've got all of this that exists there. Just having the capability to do that in your organization where needed is where we need to start. If you're going to have applications that people are accessing, and I come in as an auditor and say, hey, that's a crown jewel app, or that's a high critical app, you need to prompt for multi-factor, you need to have the ability to do so. So having these gears starting in your organization, and I would argue you should start them all simultaneously at some level. They may mature at different degrees, and you may put more effort and investment in one versus the other to start. But you're going to see that these are all going to mature to a certain point where you kind of hit a wall. And you're going to hit this wall if you don't have a holistic strategy, because PAM cannot mature past a certain point unless it truly works and integrates with IGA and vice versa. Those functions and features need to work together. And I'm not talking a tool. Keep in mind, there's tools that make this stuff happen, but take the tool out of the equation. These are practices and procedures that you're trying to fulfill, guidelines you're trying to follow, best practices you're trying to adhere to. You cannot do certain things in the PAM space without having a true IGA, process that you can lean on, and vice versa. Access management's the same. Then we look at the landscape. If we're starting to do things in the cloud, then we start to bring in CIM, Cloud Infrastructure Entitlements Management. We start looking at the intelligence piece and the awareness piece and the response and detection piece. That's where ITDR comes in. So hopefully you're getting the sense, if you're listening to this, that this kind of conversation of where to start kind of keeps growing and keeps going. And the initial stake in the ground may be different for you than another organization. But at the end of the day, you need to have these foundational things in place. You don't need to have them to their full maturity and their full capacity, but you need to have them in place. Otherwise, you're going to get to a certain point where maturity is going to just come to a halt. Like, you need to be able to lean on these. And that's the whole concept of the identity fabric, really, is these things help each other out. And again, I'm sure there's fanboys out there that will say, I like this tool and that tool, and I've always used this and I always use that. Take the tool out of the equation. Don't talk about the tool. Talk about what you're trying to accomplish. Talk about your objectives. Talk about where you want to see your organization, how secure you want to see your organization. If you've got a model that you follow, maybe it's NIST, maybe it's Carnegie Mellon for insider threat, maybe it's the NSA, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. That's great. We've got some kind of guide rails we're running on. But I would put a word of caution on everything I'm saying. And that is, and I say this because of the variable of the industries. Just because something is a best practice doesn't mean it's a best fit for your organization. You have to put a little bit of thought behind the best practices that you're going to follow. I would argue 90% of the best practices out there, yeah, we should probably all do them. But there are going to be some things that are going to be a best practice for manufacturing and maybe OT that you really don't need to invest in and put the effort and the time in if you're a software company. And vice versa. There are going to be some variables that you should take into consideration. I've gone into organizations where millions of dollars and years have been spent chasing down something that really did not add value to the organization. You could argue, yeah, it was a good thing to do, but we could have moved the needle so much further if we focused on the appropriate channels, the appropriate best practices. So that's something I'd like to do as well. Is the starting point is a variable, but here's the foundational things that really need to be in play. If you would like me to really break that apart, maybe we do a whole session on just one of those pillars and have a whole series. I'd love to do that.
I think we definitely can there, David. Definitely can. And it's fascinating listening to you describing these things. If we think back to where we started from in this conversation, you were talking about how the conversation had evolved over time, and it's kind of caught up, and we've realized the challenge of identity and how things are about identity security. In the meantime, technologies have run away with us. Organizations have grown. We've got all these interconnected things. And like you said, we're in 2024, and some organizations still have identity as a separate team from the security team. There are still challenges that we're dealing with, sweeping up legacy things where we have, RBAC, ABAC, PBAC, or RDAC, or whatever the latest acronym for controlling lists of permissions is. So thinking forward as we sort of come to the end of this session, where would you like to see the industry, the state of identity access management be in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So there's some notable things that I think occurred this year that kind of set the stage for what I would like to see. The quantum security initiative from Microsoft that happened this year, their announcement there when it comes to encryption and how they're going to use, how they would like to see things in this new quantum age that's around the corner. So some of that's some very interesting reading. United States put in an executive order for some of the, let's just say, scrutiny that should be around AI. And I call it scrutiny. I think it's just questions. Like, we should all be asking, certain questions when it comes to AI. So there's some growth there. We look at some of the fines and some of the things that occurred this year around ransomware and information. So, look at some of the results of that. The European Data Privacy or Data Sharing Act, or I forget the exact name of that, occurred. So you're seeing this response to kind of what's occurring right now, or what's around the corner. And I think that's all good. I think regulation in some aspects is good, some aspects is bad, but if anything, it gets the conversation going. So, I wanted to highlight those things because where I would love to see things head in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, so forth, is that the human factor is more in the equation. It's more of the consideration. It's more in the center of the conversation. And by doing that, identity becomes more in the center of the conversation. The identity group and the identity team has its right place in the security organization. And we look at identity as truly a security practice, not its own little thing off to the side that just hires and fires people and kills off their access. So that's kind of what I think is doable, possible here in the next couple of years. But what I'm kind of most excited about, to be honest with you, is if you really look at quantum computing and the ability and the what I would call the frontier that we're about to hit with quantum computing, think about traditional computers that just have on-off, 1 0, 1 bit at a time that it can process, and then obviously you've got, because of transistors, et cetera, we can do millions and billions of those at a time, right? Well, quantum computing, and we start getting into the qubit, where you can have now all angles at one time computed. I mean, it's going to dwarf what we previously even thought was possible in computing power. We take that and we combine that with the direction we're heading with AI. If you look at where AI is, and generative AI and machine learning and all the, even back to RPA, robotic process automation, things that could be calculated in what is today's technology, is pretty impressive. But just imagine where that will go with quantum computing and the capabilities. So what I would love to see is all these intelligence gaps that we've been talking about, and the awareness of who's doing what, and is it appropriate? Is it the right behavior? And the analysis. I think that's going to, in a couple of years, no longer be, hey, this is a gap. It's, hey, this is a pretty cool thing. And we're going to be in this room talking again in 10 years saying, well, what should the limitations of that be versus is this a capability? And I think the conversation is going to keep changing. So I'm excited for those conversations because obviously I'm sure there's some fans of Terminator and RoboCop and all these other, films that have scared us as children that we were too young to watch probably at the time, but loved them anyway. Has put in our brains about AI and robots and technology. Take all that aside. It is a realistic set of questions we should be asking, because I do think the capabilities and those gaps that we're discussing today are going to be fulfilled with the combination of where we're heading with quantum computing along with AI. And we really should be asking questions. I'm not concerned about, serving our AI overlords in the future. What I am concerned about is, are we using it in the right way? Are we using it the right manner? Are we putting the right defenses up to protect against, very, very advanced tactics from bad actors to steal our data, steal our information, pretend that they are people that they say they aren't. I've seen examples of people using this in labs to spin up entire virtual rooms and deep fake everyone and get an entire company to sign off things as if they were talking to the board. So that's where I think the conversation needs to be, obviously, in the future. So I gave you a little bit of what I think it is today, where I think it is in a couple of years, and then where I think it is in the far future. Maybe not too distant future, but far enough that I'm not losing sleep over it at the moment.
I think that's a lovely answer there. And I think, you said we would be back here on the podcast talking about this in 10 years' time in the age of quantum. But I think, Mark, we're going to have to get David back on much sooner than that, aren't we?
Yeah, I think a little bit sooner than 10 years. Maybe we can measure it in months. I think might be a better measurement. 'Cause
I'd love to come back.
I think you touched on many points today that to your point. I think we could do episodes alone on that. I know folks would be very, very interested to hear. And really appreciate you taking the time to share all your knowledge today, and all the other times that I know you're out there helping in the industry in general, right? Like we very much started this podcast as a thing to try to honor all the people that are out there making the impact in security, doing the real work, as I say, to kind of move the needle forward, right? And I think you're an absolutely great example of that. And just again, really appreciate you sharing today, man.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me and for the kind words, for sure. I think we're all in this together, and we're just got to keep moving the needle forward.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, That's it for, let's call it part 1 of Adventures of Alice and Bob with DJ. If you've enjoyed the conversation as much as we have today, we'll include some links to the articles and blogs he's recently written in the description of this episode, so you can learn more about the topics that keep him up at night and track him down online. As always, thanks to my partner in crime, Mark Mayfrey, and super producer Jesse, and the team at BeyondTrust who make this podcast happen. This has been the Adventures of Alice and Bob. Thanks for listening.